So today I want to talk about something that most people are completely missing about what just happened in the Gulf. Everyone is talking about Iran's latest military posturing. Everyone is talking about whether the Gulf states will respond, whether America will intervene, whether Israel is watching. Everyone is focused on the noise, but almost nobody is asking the question that actually matters most to ordinary people. And that question is this: while every government in the Gulf was deciding whether or not to answer Iran's signal, China had already made its decision. Quietly, completely, without a press conference, without a missile launch, without a single threatening statement, China decided the outcome before the Gulf even picked up the phone. The answer, when you look at it carefully, is that we are living through the single most consequential geopolitical realignment in the Middle East since the 1970s. And depending on where you live, the consequences for your energy bill, your savings, your food prices, your job, and your future are going to arrive faster than most people are prepared for. So today I want to walk you through exactly what Iran's signal meant, why the Gulf went silent, how China moved before anyone else even read the message, and what every one of these stories means for the world you are living in right now, part by part, step by step, in plain English. So let us begin. Everything I'm about to tell you rests on one single idea. In the Middle East, when a powerful nation sends a signal and nobody publicly answers, that silence is not inaction. That silence is a decision. And every other power in the world reads that silence immediately and adjusts. Iran sent a signal to the Gulf today. It was not a subtle one. It was designed to be heard clearly by Saudi Arabia, by the UAE, by Qatar, by every nation sitting on top of the oil reserves that power the global economy. And the Gulf's response, at least publicly, was silence. The question is no longer whether Iran has the military capability to threaten Gulf stability. The question is whether the nations of the Gulf still believe that American protection is reliable enough to answer Iran publicly, or whether they have already calculated that the smarter play is to manage Iran privately. And that calculation, that fundamental shift in how Gulf nations are thinking about their own security, is the framework you need to understand everything that follows. The more uncertain the American commitment becomes, the more Gulf nations look for alternative arrangements. The more alternative arrangements they build, the more the entire architecture of Middle Eastern security, the architecture that has kept oil flowing to the global economy for 50 years, begins to change. And when that architecture changes, your energy bill changes with it. Let me walk you through every major actor with exactly that framework in mind. On the surface, Iran looks like a nation making a desperate gamble. Its economy is under severe pressure. More than 40% of its population lives below the poverty line, according to independent economic estimates. Its currency has lost the vast majority of its value against the dollar over the past decade. Its young population is increasingly disconnected from the ideology of the revolution that shaped their parents' world. On paper, Iran looks like a nation that should be focused entirely on its own internal survival, not sending signals to its neighbors, but underneath that surface, Iran is doing something much more sophisticated than it appears. Iran is not sending a military signal, it is sending a political one. The message is not, "We will attack you." The message is, "We are still here, we are still relevant, and before you finalize any security arrangement that excludes us, you should think carefully about what that costs." Here's a specific number that makes this signal credible. Iran's network of regional proxies in Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria collectively controls or can threaten roughly 30% of the world's maritime oil shipping lanes. That is not military strength in the conventional sense. That is strategic leverage built over 40 years of patient investment in asymmetric influence. So here's the consequence chain. If Iran's proxies can threaten 30% of global oil shipping, then any security arrangement in the Gulf that does not account for Iranian interests carries a real and measurable economic Risk, if it carries that risk, Gulf nations will need to factor it in every energy deal, every investment decision, every diplomatic alignment they make. And if Iran can impose that cost simply by existing and signaling, then Iran has power that its economic weakness completely obscures. For ordinary Iranian families, this moment offers something the regime desperately needs: a reason to feel that their country still matters on the world stage, even as the economy at home tells a very different story. Now let us talk about who Iran was speaking to most directly and why they chose silence over response. On the surface, Saudi Arabia looks like a nation that should respond firmly to any Iranian signal. It has the largest military budget in the Arab world, approximately $80 billion per year. It has modern American weapon systems, F-15 fighters, Patriot missile batteries, and a navy equipped for Gulf defense. It has a formal security relationship with the United States that goes back to the deal Franklin Roosevelt made with King Abdulaziz in 1945. On paper, Saudi Arabia has every tool it needs to answer Iran loudly and firmly. But underneath that paper strength is a strategic calculation that has been changing quietly for the past several years. Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, watched what happened when his country responded aggressively to Iranian proxies in Yemen. He watched 8 years of war that cost Saudi Arabia more than $100 billion, destabilize its southern border, and produce no decisive victory. He watched America equivocate on weapons sales and political support every time domestic American politics shifted. And he drew a very clear conclusion: a Saudi Arabia that gets drawn into open confrontation with Iran every time Tehran sends a signal is a Saudi Arabia that bleeds wealth, stability, and international credibility. Here is the specific number that defines Saudi Arabia's current posture. China is now Saudi Arabia's single largest oil customer, purchasing approximately 25% of all Saudi oil exports. That is not a detail. That is a structural fact that shapes every diplomatic decision Riyadh makes. So here is the consequence chain. If China buys 25% of your oil, and China is also building a relationship with Iran, and China brokered the normalization deal between you and Iran in 2023, then publicly confronting Iran's signal does not serve your most important economic relationship. If it does not serve that relationship, you stay quiet. If you stay quiet, Iran reads the silence as a signal that its leverage is working. And if Iran's leverage is working, it will send more signals. For ordinary Saudi families, this moment means that their government is navigating a world where the old certainties, American protection, shared hostility toward Iran, are giving way to something more complicated and less predictable. That uncertainty is already showing up in how their government is spending and investing differently than it did a decade ago. Now, let us look at the other Gulf state whose silence was equally significant. On the surface, the UAE looks like a tiny nation with outsized influence. It has a population of just over 10 million people, mostly foreign workers. It has no significant military power relative to Iran or Saudi Arabia. It has no nuclear capability, no permanent seat at any international table, no historic empire to draw on. On paper, the UAE should have almost no independent voice in a confrontation between Iran and the Gulf. But the UAE has done something that most larger nations have completely failed to do. It has made itself indispensable to everyone simultaneously. Dubai handles approximately $70 billion in trade with Iran annually, much of it through informal channels, making it Iran's single most important commercial lifeline through the sanctions regime. At the same time, the UAE hosts American military bases and maintains deep security cooperation with Washington, and simultaneously, it has been quietly expanding its relationship with Beijing across technology, infrastructure, and financial services. Here is the specific number. The UAE processed approximately 20% of global gold trading in 2023, much of it connected to sanctioned economies and parallel financial systems. It has built itself into a node that every major power needs to keep functioning, and a node that everyone needs is a node that nobody wants to threaten. So here's the consequence chain. The UAE stays silent on Iran's signal, not because it is weak or afraid, but because responding would force it to choose a side in a confrontation where remaining the indispensable intermediary is worth far more than any short-term political statement. Its silence is not submission. Its silence is a business decision for ordinary families in the UAE and for the millions of foreign workers whose remittances flow back to India, Pakistan, Egypt, and the Philippines. This moment of strategic ambiguity is actually what keeps the economy stable and the jobs flowing. Now let us turn to the actor that sent no signal, made no statement, and somehow still decided the outcome. On the surface, China appears absent from this story. It did not respond to Iran's signal. It did not advise the Gulf states to respond or stay silent. It issued no statement about regional stability. If you read only the headlines, China is not in this story at all. But China decided the outcome of this story before it even began. Here's how. In March 2023, China brokered the normalization agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Not America, not the United Nations, not any European power. China, a deal that the most powerful nation in the world had spent 20 years trying to prevent, was achieved by China in a single diplomatic process. And when China did that, it inserted itself permanently into the operating system of Middle Eastern geopolitics. Here's a specific number. China imports approximately 17 million barrels of Middle Eastern oil every single day. It is the world's largest oil importer and the Gulf's single most important customer. That dependency is not a weakness. It is a source of extraordinary leverage because a customer of that scale can offer something America fundamentally cannot: a guaranteed, ideology-free, conditions-free economic relationship. So here is the consequence chain. China's investment in Gulf relationships means that when Iran sends a signal, China already has private channels to every party involved. It does not need to respond publicly because it is already managing the situation privately. If it is managing the situation privately, the Gulf states know that China is present even when it is silent. If they know China is present, they calculate accordingly. And if they calculate accordingly, China's influence over the outcome is real and decisive regardless of whether it appears in any headline. For ordinary Chinese families, this moment confirms what they have been told by the government for years, that patient economic engagement rather than military confrontation is how great powers build durable influence in the 21st century. Now let us look at the one actor whose absence from this story tells you almost as much as China's presence. On the surface, America still looks like the dominant external power in the Gulf. It has the Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain. It has air bases across Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE. It has security agreements with every major Gulf state. It has the most technologically advanced military force in human history. Positioned within striking distance of Iran on paper, America is still the undisputed external guarantor of Gulf security. But the question that every Gulf leader is asking privately is not whether America can respond. It is whether America will respond when it matters in the way they need it to. Here is a number that frames America's current position. $36 trillion in national debt with annual interest payments that have now exceeded the entire United States defense budget. That is the constraint that sits behind every American foreign policy decision, whether anyone in Washington says so publicly or not. Unlimited security commitments cost money, and America is a nation that is increasingly conscious of what everything costs. So here is the consequence chain. America's debt constrains its willingness to make open-ended security commitments. Gulf states sense that constraint even when it is not articulated. If they sense it, they hedge toward China. If they hedge toward China, American influence in the Gulf erodes gradually. If it erodes gradually, the dollar-denominated oil trading system that has underpinned American financial power since 1974, comes under quiet but persistent pressure. And if that pressure builds over 10 or 20 years, the consequences for American living standards, for the cost of American government borrowing, and for the global purchasing power of American savings are profound. For ordinary American families, this is not an abstract foreign policy problem. It is a slow-moving structural shift that will show up eventually in higher borrowing costs, higher energy prices, and a federal government with less fiscal flexibility to respond to the next domestic crisis. So now let us zoom out and look at the biggest picture of all. What every single actor in the story has in common is not oil or missiles or trade deals. What they all have in common is that they are each answering the same fundamental question. In a world where American reliability is uncertain and Chinese patience is consistent, which relationship do I build my future around? Iran answered that question by signaling that it still has leverage and is willing to use it. Saudi Arabia answered it by staying silent and building economic depth with China. The UAE answered it by becoming indispensable to everyone and therefore vulnerable to no one. China answered it by being present before the question was even asked. America answered it, whether intentionally or not, by watching from a greater distance than it once would have. And here is the crucial insight that most people are completely missing. The outcome of today's signal from Iran is not determined by what Iran did or what the Gulf decided. It is determined by a process that started years ago and has been running ever since: the systematic replacement of American credibility as the default guarantor of Gulf stability with something more complex, more multipolar, and fundamentally more Chinese in its architecture. This is not a moment. This is a direction. And directions in geopolitics, once established, are extraordinarily difficult to reverse. The Soviet Union's decline looked like a series of individual moments too, until one day it was a pattern. So what we are watching in the Gulf right now is a pattern. The bombs may not be falling. The oil is still flowing. The headlines may move on by next week, but underneath all of that, the architecture of the world your savings and energy bills depend on is being rebuilt. And China is the primary architect. I want to end with the most surprising conclusion of this entire analysis. You might expect me to say that the biggest story here is China's growing dominance of the Middle East. China brokered the Saudi-Iran deal. China is the Gulf's largest customer. China is the patient, consistent alternative to American unpredictability. You might expect me to say China won, but actually no. The most important actor in this entire story is one that barely appeared in it at all: Qatar. Qatar hosts the largest American military base in the Middle East, Al Udeid Air Base, while simultaneously maintaining one of the warmest relationships with Iran of any Gulf state. Qatar supplies liquefied natural gas to China, Europe, Japan, and South Korea simultaneously. Qatar served as the back channel between Hamas and Israel during ceasefire negotiations. Qatar maintains diplomatic relations with every significant power in this conflict simultaneously, including actors that refuse to speak to each other. Think about what that means. In a world that is reorganizing from a single American-centered solar system into a multipolar binary star system, Qatar is the only nation that has built a functioning orbit around both suns at once. It is not choosing between America and China. It is not hedging nervously. It has constructed a deliberate strategy of indispensability. If you want to talk to your enemy, you go through Doha. If you want LNG delivered reliably, regardless of political conditions, you buy from Qatar. If you want intelligence on what Iran is actually thinking, rather than what it is publicly signaling, you talk to Qatar. A nation of 300,000 citizens has made itself so necessary to so many conflicting powers that it cannot be threatened without someone important losing something they cannot afford to lose. That is not small nation weakness. That is the highest form of strategic wisdom available in the world being built right now, And while everyone is watching Iran's signal and China's silence, Qatar is quietly building the infrastructure of the next world order, one conversation at a time. So let us just recap what we covered today. Iran sent a signal to the Gulf, not a military strike, but a political message built on 40 years of asymmetric leverage over roughly 30% of global oil shipping lanes. The message was, do not build a world that excludes us. Saudi Arabia stayed silent, not from weakness, but from a strategic calculation shaped by 8 years of costly Yemen conflict, China's 25% share of its oil exports, and a fundamental recalibration of what American protection is actually worth. Under modern conditions, the UAE stayed silent too, using its extraordinary position as the indispensable intermediary between sanctioned economies and the global financial system to remain everyone's essential partner and no one's adversary. China decided the outcome without appearing in any headline because it had already built the relationships, the trade volumes, and the diplomatic architecture that made its influence structural rather than situational. America watched from a greater distance than before, constrained by $36 trillion in debt and the domestic political cost of open-ended foreign commitments, allowing its influence to erode gradually even as its military presence remained formally in place. And Qatar emerged as the most strategically positioned small nation on Earth, hosting American air power, trading gas to China and Europe, serving as the world's most essential back channel, and making itself too valuable to pressure and too connected to ignore. This war is not just a regional confrontation. It is the visible surface of a deeper restructuring of the world order that will determine your energy costs, your savings, and your government's financial flexibility for the next 50 years. The signal Iran sent today was heard by every capital on Earth. The silence of the Gulf told those capitals something important, and China had already written the answer before anyone else had even read the question.